Have you ever woken up thinking the day would be ordinary, only to find your life forever changed? That's exactly what happened to John Miller, a lonely rancher whose days were filled with hard work, silence, and a longing he didn't dare admit to himself. The ranch stretched wide under the Arizona sun, the land dry, the wind heavy with dust. John wasn't rich, though he worked harder than men twice his age. He was brave, strong, and stubborn, but inside, he carried an ache for family, for companionship, for someone who would see past the rugged skin of a rancher and find the man within. One stormy evening, his fate shifted. John found her collapsed near his barn, an Apache woman, injured, her dress torn, her eyes wide with fear yet burning with pride. She had fled violence, chased from her people, and now stood trembling at the edge of survival. Most ranchers in those days would have turned her away. Some might have feared her. But John saw something else. A human being who needed help. Without hesitation, he lifted her in his arms, carried her inside, and tended her wounds. Days turned into nights. Nights into mornings. Slowly, she began to heal. She rarely spoke, only offering her name. Nayeli. And though words were few, gratitude filled her eyes. John never asked for thanks, never expected reward. His kindness was simple, pure, an act of humanity in a world where division too often ruled. One morning, John awoke to something he never expected. On the porch sat Nayeli, dressed in garments she had sewn herself from scraps, her hair braided with wildflowers, her gaze soft yet steady. She whispered words he didn't understand at first, but her meaning was clear. She wished to stay. To be his partner. To build a life beside him. Not out of debt, but out of choice. John, a man who once believed his life would remain empty, felt his heart burst open. He hadn't saved her to gain anything. He hadn't acted from desire. He acted from compassion, and in return, life gave him the very thing he thought he would never have. But their story was not without challenge. The town frowned. Whispers spread. A rancher with an Apache bride. Many neighbors turned cold. Yet, in the midst of prejudice, John stood tall, his arm around Nayeli, unshaken. And when a flood swept through the valley, destroying homes and cattle, it was Nayeli who taught the settlers how to build shelters of willow and mud, how to find food where others saw only barren land. The same people who had once judged her now came to her for guidance, and through her strength and John's unwavering courage, the town began to change. In the end, it wasn't just John who received an unexpected reward. The entire community gained something precious: understanding, unity, and proof that love, when rooted in kindness, can cross any boundary. And so, the brave rancher who once woke up alone, woke up one morning to a life filled with laughter, warmth, and love, thanks to the courage of an Apache woman who chose to stay. That's what happened to John Miller, a rancher who lived under the wide skies of Arizona. His ranch stretched across the dry land, where cattle grazed and the desert wind carried the sound of coyotes at night. From the outside, John looked like a man who had everything: a strong back, a thriving ranch, and endless miles of freedom. But inside, he carried something heavier than any saddlebag: loneliness. John had lost his parents young, had no siblings, and though he worked harder than any man alive, he had no one to come home to when the day's labor was done. He longed for something more: companionship, family, a reason to believe life was about more than survival. But he never dared to expect it. One stormy evening, fate came knocking in a way he never could have imagined. John was finishing up in the barn, the rain pouring so hard it drowned out the sound of his boots on the wooden floor. That's when he saw movement in the shadows. His hand reached instinctively for the rifle by the door. But what he found wasn't a thief or an animal. It was a woman. She was young, her skin bronze, her hair long and dark as midnight, plastered to her face from the rain. She wore the torn remains of a buckskin dress, her feet bare and bloodied. She collapsed right there on the hay, shivering, too weak to speak. John knelt beside her, his heart pounding. She wasn't from the nearby town. That much was clear. She was Apache. And in those days, settlers and Apaches were rarely anything but enemies. But John didn't see an enemy. He saw a human being, broken and desperate. He didn't stop to wonder what others would say or what danger it might bring. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his arms and carried her inside his home. That was the kind of man John Miller was. He laid her on his bed, wrapped her in blankets, and tended to her wounds as best he could. When she finally stirred, her voice was faint, but she whispered her name, Nayeli. She said little else. Her pride was strong, her trust slow to give. But her eyes, dark and watchful, spoke of pain, of exile. She had been cast out from her people, left with nowhere to go. John didn't pry. He didn't need answers. All he knew was that she needed shelter, and he was willing to give it. Days passed. Nayeli healed. She would sit quietly by the fire, watching John work, her expression unreadable. Sometimes she would help, grinding corn, fetching water, stitching torn fabric. They barely spoke, yet in the silence something began to grow. A mutual respect, an unspoken bond. John never expected thanks. His kindness was simple, given without condition. But one morning, when the storm clouds had cleared and the desert sun burned bright again, John awoke to find something that shook his heart to its core. Nayeli stood on the porch, her hair braided with wildflowers, her torn clothes replaced with garments she had sewn herself from scraps of cloth. She looked at him not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with quiet determination. In halting English, she spoke words that would change his life. "I stay with you." John froze. He had offered her nothing but compassion, expecting nothing in return. Yet here she was, choosing to remain, choosing him. At first, he didn't believe it. Why would a proud Apache woman choose a simple rancher? But the truth was clear in her gaze. She wasn't staying out of debt or obligation. She was staying because she wanted to. And just like that, the lonely rancher who had spent years believing he was destined for solitude found his world turned upside down. But life, of course, is never that simple. The town didn't take kindly to it. When John walked through the market with Nayeli at his side, whispers spread like wildfire. A rancher with an Apache bride. People scoffed. Some turned their backs. Others spat at the ground as they passed. Prejudice ran deep, and John knew the price of standing by her would be heavy. But he never wavered. His hand never left hers. His voice never faltered when he introduced her as his partner, his wife. And then came the flood. That spring, heavy rain swelled the river beyond its banks. Homes were swept away. Cattle drowned, and the settlers who had once mocked Nayeli now stood desperate, hungry, and cold. It was Nayeli who saved them. She taught them how to build shelters from willow and mud, how to find roots and herbs that could be eaten when food ran short, how to listen to the land instead of fighting against it. Men who had once refused to look her in the eye now came to her for guidance. Women who had whispered insults now followed her example, weaving baskets and storing food as she showed them. And in those days, something miraculous happened. The walls between people began to crumble. Through Nayeli's strength, the settlers came to see the value of the very culture they had feared. And through John's courage, his refusal to abandon her, they learned that love could bridge even the deepest divides. It wasn't easy. It wasn't without pain. But by the time the floodwaters receded and the land bloomed green again, Nayeli was no longer the Apache woman. She was a wife, a teacher, and a friend to many. As for John, he woke up each morning to the sound of laughter in a home that had once been silent. He woke up to the warmth of a hand that fit perfectly in his. He woke up to love, the kind that isn't earned through wealth or beauty, but through kindness and sacrifice. The brave rancher who had once believed he'd die alone instead found the greatest reward life could offer. A partner who saw his heart, not just his calloused hands. And the lesson was clear. Sometimes the greatest rewards come not from what we chase, but from what we give freely, expecting nothing in return.